Hi, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters. I'm delighted to have Rudi Bachmann, who's a famous professor of economics, macroeconomics at the University of Notre Dame, one of our finest economics groups in the country. And Rudi's had a very interesting career in macroeconomics, but he's also kind of a major commentator, public intellectual when it comes to Europe, geopolitics, Europe's role in geopolitics and interacting with the U.S. and German politics, and he's going to talk to us today about everything going on in Europe, Ukraine, Germany. They just had their election, and Rudi, it's a delight to have you. Thank you so much for joining. Can you give us a really kind of quick background of where you're born and your career, how you got into economics, where you studied, your degrees, blah blah blah.
Thanks, Larry, for having me. This is a great pleasure to be here. I was born in Germany in 1974, middle of Germany, basically. How did I get into economics? Well, as many things in life, I got into it because of a woman. My then girlfriend, I didn't, in Germany, there's no high school economics. And so people don't know much about economics from high school when they choose their college careers. And so I had no clue about it. And so I actually was a humanities major. At least I started out as a humanities major, literature, philosophy, that kind of stuff. But then in the first semester, I knew that at least the literature part wasn't for me. I did end up finishing I do have a bachelor's degree in philosophy as well. So I ended up double majoring and then a bachelor degree in economics. And the reason why I chose economics was because my girlfriend at the time, she was studying business administration. And business administration in Germany requires, as in the US, first of all, a much more widespread than in the US. It's an undergraduate degree. But they have to take economics courses. And I studied with her. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. I like math, I like history, I like ethics, philosophy. The old Keynesian saying, if you want to be only that, if you only want to be that, then be a mathematician, be a philosopher. If you want to be all of it, then be an economist. And that was kind of true for me. So I studied it. And then, I liked it so much that I wanted to pursue it further. And at the time, that has changed now. I think German economics has caught up and you have fantastic PhD programs there. But at the time, everyone said, if you really want to be a serious academic economist, go to the US first, okay? Then later you can come back if you want to, but go to the US first. And so in 2001, I started at Yale doing my PhD. One of my first memories I have from the US is maybe 3-4 weeks in, is indeed September 11th.
Yeah.
So I was 2 hours away from New Haven, from basically the site. So I really remember this. It turns out I never went back. Actually, I did go back sometime in between. I also had professorships in Germany, but never really long. Apparently, I belong to this side of the Atlantic. I also got married to a very accomplished economist in the meantime, who is not German. And so in the end, we decided to stay in the US. And for now, last point of my career is indeed Notre Dame, which I'm very happy about.
So economics and your social life have blended very well. Okay.
Yes.
An interesting angle. So tell us about your, kind of work and involvement with kind of giving advice and being a public speaker about German politics, European politics, international politics, geopolitics.
So, as it is usual, as an assistant professor, you don't do this kind of stuff. So I started out sort of my dissertation work, and sort of my first papers, my first publication, were all about sort of heterogeneous macroeconomics of the Crusell-Smith type, the Kahn-Thomas type, so heterogeneous firm, heterogeneous household models, and sort of pushing these models and asking questions of these models. That was sort of my first time. Then I got relatively quickly into, thanks to Nick Bloom's work on uncertainty and time-varying uncertainty, which has really been career shaping for me. I got into that, and how do first firms, but also households, first sort of the effects of time-varying uncertainty theoretically, but quickly the question was also, how do we measure this stuff really properly? Are we measuring it properly with, say, the VIX, the volatility index? Isn't there more? Should we try to get into people's heads about their uncertainty? And this is where I ended up doing working a lot with surveys, mostly on the firm side, but also a little bit with household side. And that's nowadays sort of my main business. And I've used now surveys not just for sort of basic research, but also surveys to evaluate policy measures, fiscal policy measures like the temporary VAT cut in Germany during COVID and stuff like that. So that's what I'm basically doing now, working a lot with survey, thinking hard about measuring expectations, measuring perceived uncertainty, and what that means for writing down economic models. That's what I'm doing.
So, just to translate back to our kind of not necessarily economic audience. So Rudi started off writing kind of large scale models where you have households that are different in terms of their characteristics. That's what heterogeneous, and you've got firms that are producing a variety of different products.
And you are one of the pioneers of these models, right? So we are one of the giants we young people at that time, stood on whose shoulders we stood on. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I had my little part in this. But anyway, and then, economics of uncertainty was really developed by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. Von Neumann is one of the key players in the Manhattan Project in developing the atomic bomb, developing the digital computer. He was a polymath. He could
absolutely
physicist and just a genius. And
genius, yeah.
Probably one afternoon he went off with Morgenstern and developed the fundamentals of the economics of uncertainty that we use to think about people's behavior. But then Rudi's talking here about the fact that people's perception of how uncertain the world is can change through time, and that the only way you can really get at that is by kind of asking them, seeing in the data, in the survey data, how uncertain are you? And we do have, based on how options like buy a stock at this price, the fundamental formula for option pricing, which was developed by Black and Scholes and Merton. These are the folks who developed this formula, the Black, Scholes, Merton option pricing formula. It has something which is called a measure of the volatility of the economy of the market, and you can actually kind of, by looking at option pricing and looking at other things that go into the formula, you can back out what the degree of uncertainty is about the returns on the market, and that tells you something about the degree of uncertainty about the economy. So this is what's called the VIX. There's a VIX index. If you Google that, you'd see an index of uncertainty. So just as a quick lesson for the people
and this is sort of the uncertainty the market participants have in mind. What we are trying to do with surveys, of course, is trying to elicit the uncertainty of deciders at firms or households, right? And so we're really trying to get a fuller picture of how economic agents perceive uncertainty and what it does to their decisions, really. So how did I get into policy? So this was a bit, well, it had to do with Corona, frankly. And so I wasn't part at all of the USDC sort of policy advising scene, having spent most of my American career, after Yale at least, in the Midwest. It is a bit far away, and sort of I'm a bit far away from DC. And so it was for Berlin too, in the German capital, until Corona hit, because Corona eliminated this sort of physical distance problem that I had, okay? Everyone was on Zoom. I did happen to know someone in the Treasury Department in Germany, one of the state secretaries there. That guy I knew sort of through Twitter, actually, through social media, before Corona. And once Corona hit, everyone was on Zoom, And they gathered a team of economists, and sometimes we had daily briefings at the very beginning because they were completely clueless what to do. Didn't know what kind of shock it would be for the economy, how to handle it, and they really wanted advice from people that, could think through, is this a supply shock? Is this a demand shock? Is it both? What kind of uncertainty plays a role? All this kind of stuff, and they really didn't know how to think about that. And so they gathered basically German economists, both domestically, mainly domestically, but also from abroad. And again, it was just a level playing field because everyone was on Zoom, and I was sitting at home in my home here in the Midwest, and it didn't matter where I physically was, right? And so that leveled really the playing field for me, and that got me into policy advising, and helping them design their economic stimulus measures a little bit later in the summer of 2020, et cetera, et cetera. And then, after COVID, I thought I would just go back to my quiet life as an academic and keep studying uncertainty and computing these large-scale models. And then Putin's aggression, Putin's invasion of Ukraine followed. And again, politicians were asking, what can we do? What if, that will disrupt the massive inflow of carbon of sort of carbon energy imports from Russia, coal, oil, but mainly natural gas, which Germany is really so perhaps as a background, sort of the whole green energy transition in Germany, which also Germany had tried to do the double whammy, right? They tried to get rid of nuclear and tried to decarbonize basically at the same time. And sort of the transition technology that they had picked was natural gas. And that relied heavily on Russia being a reliable partner in that. And that, of course, all changed literally 3 years ago on February the 24th of 2022. And then there was this huge discussion: should we have an import embargo against Russia, especially for these fossil energy carriers? And so I got together with a bunch of economists, which is sort of a bit outside my forte. I mean, it's sort of my specialty, not my forte, but my specialty. And we just, all these economists said, if we now have sanctions against Russia and we stopped importing natural gas and oil and coal, there's going to be mass unemployment, mass poverty, a depression-like event in Germany. And we thought, well, let's think about this. What kind of model would we need, to really think this through quantitatively and not just have politicians guess from their gut feelings, and in particular, not let the employers, and I will say the employers associations, but also the trade unions, which are heavily, most heavily organized in manufacturing in these that energy-intensive industries in Germany. They were basically saying it's Armageddon. You can't do this. Okay, we are sorry for the Ukrainians, but if we do this, Germany will go under. Okay, and we said, well, we have models to do that, and then we took a little model with lots of sectors in the economy, sort of modeling the interactions between these sectors, having energy in the model, but also trade, international trade. So many countries, many sectors in the economy, and the so-called Baquet-Farhi model, that's how it's called now by two brilliant economists who first wrote down such models. And we computed it and tried to model the impact. And we basically came out with saying, it's going to be uncomfortable for Germany. There will be a recession as a result if we completely went off by, say, the summer of 2022 from Russian carbon energy. But it would be manageable. It would be sort of, at best, at worst, a COVID type of recession, which was tough. But, with the right policy measures, Germany could handle that. And it might actually, especially if we do it shock and awe at the beginning, it might actually persuade Putin to go back to the negotiation table. That was the hope. Politicians didn't follow this advice until Putin basically pulled the plug himself in roughly August 2022. And that's how it sort of became a little famous in Germany, because I was very vocal, was on national TV explaining this. And then the chancellor in Germany said, oh, these economists with their models, they don't know what they're doing. I don't believe them. My gut feeling trumps. And so that's, since then I guess I have a public voice in Germany.
But now he's been just tossed out of office.
He has been tossed out of office, and I'm still here, so I won. No, just kidding.
What does it mean that he was tossed out of office to the future of Europe? What does it mean that the neo-Nazi party has gotten 20% of the vote and is the second largest party in Germany at this point, right?
It is now the second largest party in Germany. What is perhaps even more worrisome is there's considerable regional heterogeneity, in the sense that the East Germany, so the former socialist communist GDR, that part, leaving out Berlin. Berlin is sort of a different animal. It's Germany's capital, and like most large cities, like in the US, it's uber liberal. It's very, very on the left side. So that's a slightly a different story. But the rest of former East Germany, the Nazi party, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is alternative for Germany, basically. They are now the majority party by a long shot, actually. So they're the largest party, clearly. The reason why they're only second in the whole republic is because the West is much more averse to them. Not completely immune, but there's a clear regional disparity. And there are now counties in East Germany where it's not just a plurality; they have close to an absolute majority of votes. And so some of these states, or the equivalent of the states in East Germany, they will soon become ungovernable, at least from the political middle. And that's almost more worrisome than the 20%. I will say, and this is perhaps a little interesting for sort of the US context, or for the US viewers and listeners, is that Elon Musk came very strongly out for the AfD, for that Nazi party, for this right-wing party. He talked to their leader. He had a Twitter space with her. He openly advertised for them. But that, interestingly enough, if you look at the polls before and the final result, had basically zero impact. So Elon Musk was completely irrelevant for that election, which is somewhat reassuring, actually. So unlike in the US, where he might have bigger influence on elections, here he certainly didn't have any influence whatsoever. So that's reassuring.
They weren't happy. People were not happy with his Nazi salute.
People weren't happy with the Nazi salute, and I think it's just that they are generally less.
I think he did it too well. Maybe he hadn't practiced enough. Who knows?
No, I don't think so. No, I think they just found it disgusting. In Germany, this would be actually illegal. You might at least pay a fine for it. So this might be I don't know, a misdemeanor or a small felony or something. So showing Nazi symbols in public is actually illegal in Germany. And so people are pretty disgusted about that and what he does now with Doge and all of this. So this didn't help. Okay, so that's the AfD. The other somewhat positive development is that what I call the Putin party. So Putin is the AfD, I would say, is also very Putin friendly, very Russia friendly, similar to the MAGA movement in the United States. But Putin basically had two parties in Germany, not just the AfD, so the very right-wing party. There was also the so-called BSW, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which originally is sort of a split-off from the Communist Party in Germany, but it's sort of developed into, and I have to be careful with the terminology here, I'm not saying National Socialist, because that term obviously has a specific historical meaning, but I'm going to call it a socialist national party, in the sense that they were economically had a leftist platform with, wealth tax, inheritance tax, taxes high in general, but are sort of also anti-immigrant on many social aspects. They're actually right wing. So they have an interesting anti-European, basically. They have a very interesting mix of a platform and very Putin friendly, in fact. They didn't make it. They barely, so it was almost US-like election evening for me on Sunday, where sort of, Maricopa County incoming, kind of feeling that sort of until almost the last counties were counted at 2 a.m. in the morning in Germany, we didn't know whether they would get into the parliament or not, because in Germany we have a so-called 5% hurdle. So you have to have 5% of the vote, at least, with some exceptions, but generally you have to have 5% of the vote nationwide in order to send someone at all into the parliament. And they basically, by a tiniest of margin, they failed to in the very end. So that was good. So Putin's investment in that party didn't pay off, fortunately. And yeah, now to the big honchos. The chancellor has been voted out of office. He was a member of the Social Democratic Party. They have had historically the worst result for them in the history of the modern German Federal Republic since World War II. It's unprecedented, that loss. And so he clearly, on the evening, he basically said, look, I lost, I'm stepping down. He's not stepping down. In Germany, the constitution provides for a continuity of government. So he will be a chancellor until there's a new chancellor elected. But at some point, he will just be an acting chancellor. And then he said already after that, as soon as the new chancellor is going to be elected, he will be gone from politics. And who is the big honcho now? Presumably the leader of the Christian Democratic Party, Friedrich Merz, who won, not decisively. They actually underperformed relative to polls. Was a bit of a disappointment. But he won. He has a clear plurality of votes, and now has to form a coalition government, presumably with the Social Democrats, the leader of the previous and still in power coalition for a couple of weeks. They will probably form a coalition government, which is possible. They have an absolute majority in parliament, an absolute majority of seats, and they are now entering negotiations to form this coalition government.
So what does this mean? Merz is, I mean, let's think about now foreign policy. It seems like it's pretty clear that Trump is siding with Putin on Ukraine, and either Ukraine hands over half of its rare earth metals to the U.S. for nothing, apparently, or Vladimir, take the whole thing. It's all yours. We're leaving Europe. That seems to be the message that Trump is spreading or conveying. Where that's coming from, we can debate. But if that is the reality, which everything seems to suggest it is, how does Europe react? How can Europe defend itself against Russia at this point? Does this mean Ukraine collapses? Where do you see things going?
I hope not. Look, I'm not a military expert, but from an economic point of view, I think there's a lot that Europe can still do. And I will explain why I think that is. I also think that there are some indications that Friedrich Merz will be much more of a hawk towards Russia compared to Olaf Scholz, who had sort of let me say, a milquetoast approach towards Ukraine and Russia.
My expression would be wash rag.
Yeah. Similar to Biden, actually. So he was he was in some sense the closest Biden ally in the world. He kind of hid behind Biden, and the moment Biden did a step forward, Scholz would also take that step, but never more. He would never take over the initiative. He would never talk to Biden and say, look, we need to do this additional step. That would always be others like the Brits or the Baltic states or the Poles or maybe the French. But sort of Scholz was never that. So I will say the good news is, well, the good news and the bad news, I guess. Friedrich Merz is sort of the most diehard transatlanticist of the old school that you can possibly imagine in German school. He's rather old. He's a Christian Democrat. That means a conservative. He is the guy, sort of the way that would have worked like completely perfectly with Ronald Reagan, certainly Bush the elder, probably also Bush the younger, right? That's the kind of guy you need to think about in terms of Friedrich Merz. So he's a big America fan. He just loves America, at least the old America. And for him, to his credit, however, he's under no illusions what MAGA means. Okay, that MAGA is a dismissal, the refusal of that old beacon of hope, Reaganite kind of America that so many Germans have, grown to be fond of, at least Germans on the conservative Christian Democrat side. And so for him, first of all, it's a big step to have to admit that. But to his credit, he's under no illusion. He understands that, and he basically on the evening of the election, he basically said, "This is over." He understands that Trump wants something different, and while his hand and his ear will always be open, he also was very clear that Europe now needs to understand. Needs to view the US under its current administration no longer as a staunch ally, but as a systemic, not foe, that would be too much, but at an adversary, basically, as someone that can't be trusted necessarily and can't be relied upon. So he's under no illusions, and I think he understood that, and he's trying to organize that now. He's not even in power. He hasn't been formally elected, right? So the chancellor in Germany, you need to understand that, is not elected by popular vote. It's elected in parliament. The only thing Germans elected yesterday was the parliament. So he still needs to be elected chancellor. So at this point, he's just still the opposition leader, with the hope of becoming a chancellor. But that's about it. So his action radius is still a bit limited. But what he's trying to do now is really reaffirm a European coalition, which Scholz has been terrible at, really keeping Europe together, because he always hid behind Biden. And so he neglected the European relationships. That's something that Merz is now trying to do. And trying to, get everyone commit with troops, with money. There is, we have $300 billion. We have $300 billion or euro, I forgot which one, almost the same, of frozen Russian assets that can immediately be unfrozen and used to buy weapons in the international weapons market for Ukraine, right? So Germany is currently spending roughly not a quarter, 0.25% of its GDP in Ukraine aid, right? We're doing a lot, but in terms of our GDP, we could do so much more, and how crucial it is for Ukraine to, if not win, at least for now, to hold the Russians at bay. And if Europe did that, there's so much more we could do, so much more we can buy. So it's not a question of economics. Absolutely, it's a political will question. Economically, Europe could do so much more. We can't produce everything quite. We don't have the physical production capacity, but so be it. Then buy it in international markets, buy it from the Israelis, buy it from the US, if need be, at least. And at the same time, in parallel, build up our production capacities.
Buy it from the Chinese?
If that's what it takes to make that deal with the devil, fine. I don't know whether the Chinese would sell it if it goes to the Ukraine. Not sure. But at this point, I think, who cares? We need to buy it. It's not a question of economics. It's not a question of financing. It is a bit of a question of production capacity, right? On the other hand, the Ukrainians have built up an enormous amount of, defense industry, especially modern defense industry, like drones and stuff like that. So a lot of what they do need is basically financing, and Europe is absolutely capable of doing it. The question is, are they willing to do it? It's purely a matter of political will.
It sounds like the will is coming around. There's a question of whether there's time to get this to happen, and whether the security agreement that Ukraine is going to need to settle is going to be European troops in Ukraine, right up, I think, to the border with Russia. It seems to me. Do you see that security arrangement happening? Do you think that would be part of a peace agreement? that the
I
Europeans?
think it will have to, frankly. I mean, they have, because of the election campaign, German politicians have been very non-committal about that because obviously that's not popular. Putting German troops right at the border to Russia, that will require some political leadership. This can go wrong.
Feels like
Um,
old times, right?
I'm sorry.
Feels like old times.
It's that. On the other hand, you know, this is a bit of a selective reading of history, if we're honest, because it is the Ukrainian theater and the Belarusian theater where the Wehrmacht and especially the troops behind the Wehrmacht, the Waffen SS, committed the most atrocities. So it's actually somewhat ahistorical to say Russia had the most to suffer from German aggression in World War II. They had to suffer a lot. I'm not saying I don't want to diminish this, but if we want to measure this, right, and this is kind of obvious because of geography, right? It is through Ukraine and Belarus that the German troops first went forward until they were stopped by Stalingrad, okay? And they had to go back in a couple of years a backward fight. And so that's where the atrocities, that's where the concentration camps happened, also Poland, right? That's where the atrocities were committed and unspeakable atrocities in Ukraine. So I think you could argue, by contrast, I would argue if the Germans have any obligation historically out of the atrocities of World War II and the Third Reich, it is to help to make sure that this never happens again to the Ukrainians, and therefore to help the Ukrainians. That's my personal reading of history, my personal sort of conclusion from history. But I think there's a case to be made.
I share that view 100%. I think Germany has a moral obligation to defend Ukraine.
Absolutely. And it's not just moral, it is a security. It is, forget about morality. I agree, it has this moral obligation, but it's also about our own security because it's obvious that if Putin, and he has said this many times, I mean, a lot of his cronies have said this, they don't want to stop in Ukraine. They're interested in the Baltics, they're interested in Poland, at least Eastern Poland. And they're committing all manner of cyber attacks almost on a weekly basis in Germany now, all kinds of sabotage acts. And if he isn't stopped, Germany just won't be a free country anymore. I don't know whether he will ever try to put tanks in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Who knows? That's far off. I agree. He may not have the military capabilities, but Germany would basically be. It could be blackmailed all day long if it succumbs now to this Russian aggression. So Europe just wouldn't be a free continent if he was allowed to do that. I wanted to say one more thing about the finance issue because there is actually a somewhat interesting political economy problem as well going on right now, because for reasons unrelated to all of this, Germans a couple of years ago put a so-called debt brake into their constitution. Okay. It's a bit like the debt. It's not quite the same as a debt ceiling in the US, but it's basically a number that where Germany, at least in normal times, the constitution requires a sort of states an upper bound for the flow deficit, so that the annual budget deficit that the German federal government can have and also the state governments can have. That's currently in the constitution. And the problem is that the new parliament will no longer have a constitution changing majority from the three middle centrist parties, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens. The rest, in fact, the extremes, the communists, who are somewhat pro-Putin, not quite as much as the right-wing people, but still somewhat pro-Putin, and then the AfD, the right-wingers, they have now a so-called blocking minority. So they have more than 1/3 of the seats, just barely, but that's the case. So Germany enters a parliamentary phase in the new parliament where it's basically almost impossible to change the constitution and therefore to change these debt rules and these deficit rules. The problem is that the massive rearmament that Germany now needs to do, both for itself but also to help Ukraine, to compensate what will be missing from the US, they have to take on debt, right? Initially, at least for the initial sort of the initial compensation. Eventually, it has to be financed by taxes because it's a permanent problem. But initially, you really don't want to finance this all through taxes. That would be, the distortions would be enormous. If you cut social spending, it would be politically feasible. So you have to work a little bit with debt. And that's currently the big question mark, because once the new parliament gets together, what to do, okay? And now they are discussing whether the old parliament will still change the constitution to basically create a constitutional loophole for rearmament spending. But that's currently the interesting debate we have in Germany now. What will be possible? Will they do this in the next couple of weeks before the new parliament gets together? What if that doesn't work? So that's still a little bit of the problem.
And you said that there's a 300 billion of frozen Russian assets. Do the Europeans have the power by themselves to unfreeze them and spend
Yes,
them?
it's sitting in Europe. They could do it. They haven't done it yet so far because they were worried about retaliation and other countries willfully confiscating European assets as a retaliation measure. But then again, the assets we have currently in Russia, I think their market value is zero anyway, so get rid of them. I don't know what China will do. Maybe some other Russian allies might use this in the future. That has been the argument, that we don't do this. Sort of been against international law, apparently, to do this. But I would say the heck with international law at this point. At this point, it's about the survival of Ukraine, the continued free existence of Europe, and they need to find a legal way to unfreeze these assets. So the money is there. They can do it. The lawyers, this is now up to the lawyers to do it in a way that's, somewhat palpable, I guess.
Let me ask you one last question, Rudy, and we'll let you go.
Oh, this is fun. Don't worry.
If you observe everything going on in the US, we have, people, Bannon, Musk doing Nazi salutes, and as if this is acceptable, President saying nothing. We have him freeing Proud Boys and other people that attacked the police physically on January 6th. We have him siding with Putin, even kind of aping his language, joining, as I said, Belarus and North Korea and Russia in the UN.
We have him talking about himself as a king.
As a king. I think it's soon going to be a god. Does this feel like 1933 again to you? That's my question.
So that's an interesting question. And the short answer is yes, and I'll get back to this. Look, at the end of the day, no one knows. We don't know what's in his head. We don't know what compromat the Russians might have. It could also be that for him, it's all about, making business now with Russia again, and personal business, and enriching himself. So it could just be as simple as, Zelensky didn't give him the stuff he wanted against the Bidens. And, a mafia boss just never forgives this. And so he's just a mafia boss. But in that sense, not ideological. That's my favorite theory, frankly, because he grew up basically in the New York real estate business. And, we all know what that means. I will say, though, that for some other people like J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, and sort of a large contingent of the more reflective background people there are, okay? I think it's a genuine love for a dictatorship, a genuine conviction that liberal democracy, liberal Republican small r, democracy small d, a democracy just isn't the optimal form of government, and that an oligarchy that enriches themselves, first of all, but also I think someone like J.D. Vance, I think, genuinely believes that sort of a form of theocracy, a Catholic theocracy for the masses, okay, that protects them, that gives them comfort, that protects them from the degeneracies, as he probably views it, of the modern age, combined with sort of an oligarchy as the sort of overall leadership, under then of a somewhat centralized but not absolute absolutistic emperor in the middle, aka the president. In other words, what I would call a neo-feudalist regime. I think that's their favorite form of government. So they have an intellectual background. Again, I don't know that Trump thinks that way, that he even understands that way. Again, for me, the mafia boss theory is still the best. And sort of, again, mafia boss means you have to have credible retaliations against people who don't follow your advice. So that's my theory about Trump. Again, I can't prove this, as I'm not, in anyone's head. I can only read what people write, what they say, how they behave. Last point about 1933. And this is indeed mind-boggling to me. Also, the sort of what they're currently doing with vis-a-vis the freedom of the press and the freedom of academia, because I think both of these freedoms, that's sort of the next step that they are impinging on and trying to get rid of. And the perverse thing, mind you, they will sort of nominally be always pro freedom of speech. They will be these freedom of speech warriors, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion. The point, though, is freedom of speech and freedom of opinion is a perverted thing without the freedom of the press and without the freedom of academia and without sort of an independent, say, national statistics, which they're also impinging on, right? That's all. There's a major war currently going on our national statistics. Let's not forget that. And I think that's really frightening. We may get into a time where we don't even know what the inflation numbers are going to be, what the growth numbers are going to be. And so without these three freedoms, the personal freedom of opinion is essentially the freedom of Elon Musk, the freedom of people who run these big opinion-shaping platforms, but not, it's a perverse freedom of speech. So, and to me as a German, having studied not the Holocaust is not the right historical episode, I think, that you want to study. What you really want to study is sort of the final years of the Weimar Republic and the initial years of the Nazi regime, right? When there was not yet a Holocaust. But the speed with which the Nazis managed to dismantle a relatively dysfunctional republic, I will say, though, in Nazi Germany, they did it from a time of low prosperity, of real economic crisis, right? Whereas in the United States, we seem to be doing this from a position of relative economic prosperity, which is, I think, unprecedented. I'm not saying that everything is well with our economy. I'm not saying that, but we still have relative economic prosperity, certainly compared to Germany 1933, right? And but the way they do this, the way they go after academia, the way they go after the press looks all too familiar. And it's just mind-boggling to me how some of my, American colleagues, which are not, I don't know that I have a mega colleagues anywhere in academia, but often, American-born colleagues, how they are still convinced of this American exceptionalism that, this can't happen in the US. The sort of the Fukuyama thesis, the US style liberal Republican democracy is the end point of history, and everything will always converge to it. And even though if we maybe MAGA shakes us a little bit out of that equilibrium locally, it's still the global attractor, to speak in economic terms, and really no other equilibrium is even thinkable, right? And so they believe institutions will hold, and eventually it'll just go back to this. And as a German, I have to say, I think you're kidding yourself. This is just naive, and it's this childish idea of American exceptionalism that's based on, I don't know, nothing at the end of the day. I don't know. I think it's naive to believe that that's the only sort of way forward for the United States, and the United States can't experience what Germany experienced in 1933. Again, I'm not talking about the Holocaust. That's a step too much. I don't know that. I don't expect that. But certainly a complete dismantling of the republic reshaping of the republic into a neo-feudalist oligarchy. I think this is entirely possible. Will it happen? I don't know. I hope not, certainly. But we shouldn't just be naive and trust the system that there will be sort of magically a rebound back to the old system.
Yeah. All right, Rudi, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. We will keep in touch, and let's hope the best for Germany, the US, and the rest of the world.
And Ukraine.
And Ukraine, I'm sure Ukraine going forward.
Yeah, Larry, it was a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed it a lot.
My pleasure. Take care. Cheers.
Cheers.